Welcome to our grief support for the LGBTQ plus community. I'm Dr. Elaine Dispo-Rendón, and I'm certified in grief counseling and specialize in pet loss grief support through the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals and its American Academy of Grief Counseling. I offer these services through my ANAK KO 501c3 nonprofit charity foundation for bereaving families. Before we offer grief support to the LGBTQ plus community, we must be understanding of the challenges that this population has had to endure, including limitations on the research and the practice of grief counseling specifically to them, in addition to the fact that they may also come from other diverse minority cultures. In addition to the sexual identities of being transgender and non-binary. And many clients may seek grief counseling and support because they lost their romantic partner. So we'll explore the different dynamics of same-sex relationships between the surviving partners and terminal partners or deceased partners. Now, the LGBTQ plus community is an abbreviation for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And they have experienced stigmas for their sexual identities and sexual orientations, which really does make the coping with grief much more challenging because they've already endured so much trauma leading up to their experiences with grief and mourning and bereavement. Now, in terms of self-talk and intrapersonal communication within somebody who identifies himself, herself, or themselves as LGBTQ plus, there is what's called angel and ghost messages, meaning the internal messages from within. The angel messages are receptive towards developing and evolving gender identity and not necessarily the one that that person was born with, versus the ghost internal message, which is resistant from deviating away from the gender norms. Now, in approaching grief from the standpoint of being LGBTQ, there must be resilience, which is bouncing back. And these ordinary magic skills involve processes and strategies to help cope with adversity, including grief. And these skills can develop from within, again, intrapersonal, in addition to interpersonal, relational with other people. And these coping mechanisms can help somebody thrive in the future with the resilience. Now, if a group is being resilient together, that's what's called community resilience. And usually these come from groups that identify themselves in the same demographic group or share the same beliefs, values, and attitudes. Now, when an LGBTQ plus individual approaches grief counseling, there may be some hesitation because barriers can include financial and location issues. The grief counseling services may be too expensive for them to afford, or some may require insurance that they may not already have to cover those expenses, or they may live in an area that does not offer grief counseling, maybe a rural area or one that is not as supportive to the LGBTQ plus community. But ways that we as grief counselors can prevent those barriers from being an issue is that we could offer services pro bono or free, or at least for a reduced fee on a sliding scale. And for those who have location barriers, we can offer telecounseling in the form of virtual video calls or phone calls, but of course, still include stipulations in our contracts that we do maintain confidentiality. For example, I myself offer Microsoft Team meetings. Now, grief support from shared demographics, in addition to being LGBTQ plus, may be at an advantage. So if somebody who identifies themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer may find more connection with grief support from others who share another demographic, including special needs or disabilities, being on a similar education level or ethnicity and race, or socioeconomic class. Now, in terms of religion and spirituality, there has been mixed support. Many people from the LGBTQ plus community may have turned away from their faith because they did not feel supported in their choices of sexual identity or sexual orientation. And some may have turned to their beliefs through those struggles, or may have even had the support that they may have needed or sought from their own religious affiliations or their own worship communities. Now, from within other cultural backgrounds, they may have also sought holistic healing methods. For example, an Indian-based practice called Ayurvedic medicine may have been helpful, and that's just one form of indigenous healing from a culture that could help the LGBTQ plus community cope with their own grief. Now we'll go on to different age groups, in particular the older group, gerontology, because there is not enough research in terms of culturally responsive practices for the aging LGBTQ plus community and other diverse ethnic communities. So those who may be triple minorities may identify themselves as LGBTQ plus, may be of color, and also in the senior age bracket may not feel as supported by their communities overall, by society in general. So it may be difficult for them to even seek grief counseling because it has been so limited for them to have those kinds of resources to support them through grief. So it makes it even more complicated because they have social isolation. They may be put down because of their socioeconomic class, or if they're of color, they may have already been targeted racially. And of course, they're experiencing sexism because they're of a sexual identity minority. And if they've lost a romantic partner from the same sex or from a gender fluid situation, they may have felt to be a misfit or an outcast. And other very high risk factors include substance abuse or codependency on other family members. Maybe their living situation is not ideal and they may have been at risk for being evicted. And we also must consider specifically the transgender aging population. 13% have reported having abused alcohol and drugs, and 16% have reported that they have attempted suicide. And speaking of transgenders, those who are transgender male may not have had support from parents, or their parents may themselves feel like they're experiencing grief or loss because their child has decided to transition to the gender that they were not born with. So there has been a study called an interpretive phenomenological analysis for meaning making to explore the ambiguous loss, because it's been very unclear of how parents cope with that grief of their child transitioning. And one factor to consider would be the gender of the parents, the mothers who are female, the fathers who are male, for the grief counselor or grief therapist to navigate how to help those parents cope with that challenge and hopefully support their transgender child more. Now, unfortunately, many transgender people have died as a result of being targeted in hate crimes or bullying, and may have been killed in homicide or death by suicide. So on November 20th, a day is commemorated to honor their memory. Now, aside from the English language, non-binary is not a word in many other cultures, but a couple of exceptions include Polynesian with the word mahu, and in some Native American cultures, the translation for two-spirit is used to refer to the binary population. Now, diving into same-sex partner loss, we call women who have lost their female partners lesbian widows, and men who have lost their partners gay widowers. Now, distinguishing between lesbian widows and gay widowers, lesbians tend to have a very deep emotional connection with their soulmates. And both lesbian widows and gay widowers have mixed support from family members. Some do have support from their families and even the families of their deceased partners. But unfortunately, not all of them have that support from their families or the families of their deceased partners. As a matter of fact, some same-sex partners may even stay in the closet within their own relationship for fear that they would be rejected by their families or society, whether that include their colleagues at work or their different communities within their city. However, lesbian widows have reported mixed support and also spiritual practices, meaning that they may have stayed within their faith practice, but some may have left the faith because there wasn't support or because they feared that coming out of the closet would cause them to be rejected by those who are religious. But many lesbian widows have reported that when they celebrated the funeral or memorial service of their deceased partner, that they ended up having a religious ceremony, or that they ended up turning to their faith to help them cope with their grief. Unfortunately, for lesbian widows, they have felt doubly traumatized with disenfranchised grief, which is grief not acknowledged or openly recognized by society, because they felt like they were rejected as somebody who identified as lesbian, not just by society in general, but even others within the lesbian community. Now, fortunately, on the other side, for gay widowers, many have felt more support because there are more groups targeted for grief recovery, especially during the AIDS epidemic. There have been grief recovery groups specifically for gay widowers who lost their partners to AIDS and being HIV positive. There are also smaller units in the forms of two partners who are there to support one another as gay widowers, or one may have gone through grief of a deceased partner before and is helping another gay widower who is fresh within his grief. But those groups for grief recovery for gay widowers are more common than groups who support lesbian widows. Now, gay widowers have different support groups. They can include bereavement groups, but they can include survival groups, because some gay widowers may be so devastated that it's hard for them to do just the self-functioning care that they were once able to do when their deceased partner still was alive. So even just being able to survive and thrive again has warranted the need for these survival support groups for gay widowers. And peer initiatives that gay widower grief recovery support groups have offered include AIDS memorials for individuals who have died from AIDS, or those who are part of the group overall have celebrated multiple men who have died from AIDS, because gay widowers may have grieved not just for their own deceased partners, but many friends within their circles who have died from AIDS or the HIV positive virus. Now, there are also buddy projects where they partner up and be able to do certain things together just as friends, and they may even knit memorial quilts in memory of their deceased partners and other friends who have died. Now, focusing more specifically on gay widowers whose partners have died from AIDS, some may have that added burden of grief because not only did they lose their partner, they probably stayed in the closet, or they probably don't have support from their family of origin, including their parents or their siblings, or the families whose households they grew up in. Now, we as grief counselors are obligated to create a safe space that is flexible for our client to grow and navigate through his grief, and identify those gay widowers' trauma responses to ongoing losses, because again, they may have lost a partner to AIDS, but they also may have lost friends along the way, and they may also continue expecting losing the more friends who have been diagnosed with AIDS. Now, they may endure what is called anticipatory grief, which is expecting a loss to happen and having to cope with it because they know that the death is going to happen at some point soon. Now, for those who are in same-sex relationships but are not losing their partner to AIDS or HIV, have reported in their own grief recovery that they did actively participate in the funeral or memorial service for their deceased partner. They were involved in planning it, or they were recognized during those ceremonies, and that helped with their healing. Another way that they were able to mend their hearts was that they did disclose to their families about their homosexual relationships. Now, other ways to heal in terms of their self-care include listening to music and practicing their respective faiths. Now, we ourselves, as grief counselors who treat clients who have gone through the loss of a same-sex partner, must also be able to take care of ourselves, speaking of self-care, and really be cognizant about preventing burnout and vicarious trauma. Because if we have also gone through grief ourselves, or if we identify with certain demographics that our own clients identify with, whether that be in the LGBTQ plus community, or being an ethnic or racial minority, or someone of intellectual or developmental disabilities, or any other demographic that is similar or the same as our own clients, we also may experience what is called vicarious trauma. So we want to make sure that we take the measures of seeking clinical supervision in addition to self-care measures like the previous slide of listening to music or practicing our faith. Journal writing can be very effective in addition to meditation. Those mental exercises go a long way, and physical exercise as well, and other hobbies like visual arts, performing arts, gardening, cooking, just anything, any activity that is going to help take care of ourselves. Because as grief counselors, we are very empathetic and we do have those feelings and we want to help our clients. But in order to help them, we must also be able to help ourselves. These are the articles and books that I've gathered my information from for grief counseling and support for the LGBTQ plus community. And thank you for tuning in, because this means that you want to be able to offer that kind of support to those who have identified themselves in this sexual and gender identity and sexual orientation minority group. So we really want to be able to help groups that are underserved, including this one. So God bless you, and I wish you all well in your grief support journey.